Hey, welcome to Ed, a podcast about the teaching life. This is Conversation 84, and I'm your host, Shane Lawrence. Ed is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network powered by ATB. And joining me this week is Maire Cervenak. Right on, Maire. Well, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I am doing pretty well. It's we're in the middle of exams right now, so as an option teacher, I have pretty easy breezy days.
I remember those times well.
Well, how's your day been?
It's been great. Yeah, got a lot of work done. I'm totally obsessed with the Marie Kondo show on Netflix right now, so it's motivating me. I know, but I feel like it's a good motivation for me because I need to get organized. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, in between working on projects and things like that, I'm like, well, I should probably work on my house as well.
Yep. Yeah. No, my wife is really into that show, so we're. Oh my goodness.
I know, the woman is totally adorable.
She is. I watched one episode and I was like, okay, I get it.
Yeah,
I'm good.
I do. I get the addiction.
Yeah, I mean, it's not for me. It is for me because I'm horrendously disorganized. But I just the show.
Well, let me hear. Let me tell you, it's so much easier to watch people get organized than to do it yourself.
Oh yeah.
You know, I'd much rather just watch someone clean my closets, but that's not going to happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, when we win the lottery, we can, hire
fingers
those
crossed.
things out. Yeah. That's what my wife keeps saying. Oh, all we need to do is just win the lottery. It's just one simple
it's
thing.
going to happen. When people are down on their luck, it's when it's happened. So it really, it's going to be my moment any day now.
Exactly. So as things get worse, they can only get better more easily, right?
That's exactly right.
Awesome. Well, Maire, thanks so much for coming on the show today. Really appreciate that.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Right on. So before we dive into that, you're kind of in a different place in the educational world. Can you tell me a little bit about what is your place in the educational world?
So I was a teacher for 10 years, a classroom teacher, elementary. Mm-hmm. Most of my tenure was spent in grades 3 to 5. I've taught them all, mm-hmm. but I best related to kids in the upper grades. That was where my passion was. I left teaching a year ago, and at that time I was teaching 5th grade math and science, and loved it and loved doing it. In fact, in my last year, it was just math and science that I was teaching, and I was able to dive in so deep, and I had 2 sections, and I am such a science girl. Mm-hmm. So it really was a good note to go out on. Mm-hmm. But I left because I got an opportunity here in our state working for the Department of Education. And that was more my passion. So my passion was to go into a position where I could help teachers mm-hmm. and provide professional learning opportunities and visit schools and do everything to promote really good learning and to assist wherever I could, and to just give back to a career that gave me a lot.
And so that's where you're at now.
That is not where I'm at now. So you know what? It's so funny. I always say to people, like, I kind of have quite a story, but my story is an interesting one I always say, like, the theme of my life is for anyone who's ever made a mistake. I am like the poster child for how to survive that. So I guess I have to start 5 years ago. I was at my local district teaching. Mm-hmm. And colleagues and I were at a professional development or professional learning sort of, what's that called? No, we were at a PD event, and we had just gotten new software. And at this time, it's really important to describe the climate of my district at the time.
Okay.
We had a new superintendent, endless change. Our programs were turned over. Our language arts program, we had a new one. We had a new math program. We were buying software. We were a one-to-one district. We were becoming really tech heavy. And we were constantly trying every new piece of software that came out on the block. And it was overwhelming. And in this particular training session, we were getting trained on software that was used to assess kids. Mm-hmm. So any tests that you could give, any quizzes, everything was plugged into the software. It would generate results. It would keep kids, you could group kids, you can keep kids in groups. Anyway, during this training, the trainer would constantly refer to some features of the software that were used to group kids. And she would say, the best part about the software is you can create groups by ability. You can create ability groups. So already my friends and I are just getting extremely irritated because this is such an archaic notion to create ability groups and leave them there. Everything I do is fluid. I didn't really have a group in my class that ever looked like that every day. The groups constantly changed based on the kids' needs. So already we were like, oh, this is weird. And at one point, the trainer had said, well, you can create groups in this software and you can label the groups with names and hide the group names. So my friends and I were kind of looking at each other and we're like, what? So this prompted my colleague to go online on our computers, and we were in a back channel chat pretty much to just talk about how nonsense this training was. So instead of text messaging each other, this is what we did. And at the time that she said, well, you could just, you could create groups. And so we had started chatting online, and we were saying things like, well, what does this woman think you would call a group of kids that you wouldn't want them to see? So then what we proceeded to do was list archaic names of groups. Like at some point I was like, oh, why don't you call them morons? Or no, none of this was serious. It was all this, we were making fun of what was happening in the room. And, and to kind of put it in perspective, it's like a group text with your these were my best friends, and they knew that we knew that what we were saying, none of it was serious. We were frustrated at the training. We were joking around, and that's all it was. It was a couple of lines of nonsense.
Yeah.
Because we thought what she was saying was nonsense. Long story short, there was an employee sitting behind me who was, I guess, thought we were fooling around, which we were, and snapped pictures with her phone of the chat and brought these pictures to a supervisor and look what they're saying. And we were called in. And when I got called in, I thought, oh my God, no, that's not what I meant. I wasn't making fun of kids. You have to understand, there was I just thought this was an easy thing to explain myself out of. I never intended to use words in that way, but when we sat down and we were with the superintendent, what you don't see, and for anyone familiar with the story that it became, you don't know that there's a new superintendent that is battling our union. And the person that was in this chat with me was the head of our union. Well, the head of, the chapter in my school. And they would always go back and forth. So this was a great opportunity to really not listen to our story, because you could get us in trouble. Like if you wanted to, and you wanted to take those comments for face value, you could say, oh, this is horrible. And that's what he did. And he sought tenure charges on 4 of us. And we had the unions gave us lawyers, and we had our lawyers come in, and even these union appointed lawyers couldn't believe that this was where this was going. Once we kind of said, listen, this was a chat. There was no special ed kids. There was no kids. There was no kid. We didn't even have students at the time that we were talking about. We were making fun of somebody saying something so archaic in a training that we were coming back with archaic terms. They were, you're taking these things totally out of context.
So what was that like? Like, this sounds kind of like a pretty surreal situation.
It was. And I think that looking back at it now, how I survived, that's 5 years ago. And this story went to the papers. And when it went to the papers, it painted I won an award as a teacher. I went and got my master's in special ed. My daughter has special needs and has Tourette syndrome and sensory processing. I am not a monster that makes fun of kids. And that's what that news story was. It was 4 really bad teachers, and it spun this story. And at that time, I mean, I remember going into my bedroom and just laying in the fetal position and just sobbing because everyone was going to think I'm a monster, and I'm not, and I wasn't a monster, but I allowed myself to almost believe that for a moment. And it was surreal. And all of a
Mm.
sudden, you're someone who is this, oh, like, prize teacher. Like, parents would request me. I integrated our multiply disabled classes into my general ed class. I had special ed students for years. And I was this teacher who loved my students as much as I love my own daughters. And all of a sudden, I'm on the front page like a monster.
Mm.
And slowly after that, I mean, we went through arbitration and all of that, but my life just fell apart. I mean, my marriage broke apart. Everything just crumbled from the stress of it. And I picked myself up, and after the arbitration, we were given, suspensions, and we went right back into the classroom. I was given a 120-day suspension, and I went
Mm.
right back into the classroom. And I didn't go back into the classroom with mobs of people protesting. I didn't have a parent say, I don't want her as my child's teacher. I didn't have a student say, oh, you did something. Nothing. I expected to go back and have my colleagues shun me. And none of that happened because the people that knew who I was, and the parents and the children and my colleagues and the administrators, they welcomed me back with open arms because it was just they felt like, I think you suffered enough for this.
You've done your time.
I did my time. And I went back and I taught for 4 more years and taught just passionately, just like I had for the 4 years prior,
Mm.
until I accepted a job at the Department of Education. And I thought at the time, well, this is great. This is a new opportunity for me.
Mm.
And I'm going to start over, and I'm going to do professional learning. And that's where my passion was. I described myself in education as someone who can kind of like pick up an instrument and just play by ear. It's honestly, it sounds weird, but education doesn't come easy to me, but I just get it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I can see where I want it to go. I see this utopian sort of idea of what education should be. So when I went to the Department of Education, I went into their professional learning department, but within a very short time, I was quickly promoted to the director of what we called the Professional Learning Network. And we
Mm-hmm.
were going to build this statewide network of educators, to support them, to provide resources, to celebrate their work. And at the time in New Jersey, the governor was in the news almost every week for what I guess you could call like a bad hire, or a weird hiring process and things like that. And there was part of me that always thought, at the time when I went to the Department of Education, I had already changed my name back to my maiden name.
Mm-hmm.
And I was no longer the name I taught at in my previous district. And so really when I went there, I never talked about what happened 5 years ago, because in my eyes, that painted a picture that was not an accurate representation of me. It was a very small part of a very long career. And long
Yeah.
story short, in November, someone at the department called a newspaper and thought, I don't think they thought I should have been promoted that quickly. And then said, listen, just so you know, this girl used to teach and she had tenure charges filed against her years ago. So what they did was rehash an old story. There was nothing new that happened, but because they rehashed the old story, and in my personal opinion, because they didn't want to mess, I was let go. So I was under contract there, and it was just like, okay, well, we have to end your contract. And I thought, all right. And I think I didn't really think much else other than, and it was very funny this time around. It was this one article that came out on a Friday night, and it
Mm-hmm.
came and went. And it wasn't a new story. There was no new mistake. There was just this old rehashed sort of story that I guess made a good Friday night headline that
Mm-hmm.
had a woman who worked hard every day to make educators in New Jersey feel supported, lost her job, lost her pension, did all of these things. And, it's very indicative of the society we live in.
I bet your story is probably a little bit different than Maire's, but maybe you find yourself in the same place where you happen to be an entrepreneur. And if you are starting to build a business, the ATB's Entrepreneur Center is a great resource. They can help with banking and they can set you up with a mentor. There's also opportunities for networking and workshops to help make local connections within the community. And it's just another way that ATB will always be more than a bank. You can visit their locations in Edmonton, Calgary, and Lethbridge, or you can go to albertaentrepreneurcenter.com. All right, let's get back to Maire.
It's very indicative of the society we live in.
Well,
I think
there's kind
you
of
make
this,
a mistake. And,
yeah. No, what I tend to see more. You don't see the headlines about teacher cares about children and does a great job. You see the ones about the teachers who are having inappropriate relationships or getting fired for whatever. I mean, and that's a very different story than what you have, obviously. But the negative headlines are the ones that tend to fill the news feeds.
And it's so much easier to paint me as a villain. And I think, and I've done it, I don't do it anymore. But before I was in the paper years ago, of course, anything I read was true. Every single thing I read in the newspaper, I just assumed, oh my God, that's horrible, because I thought it was true. Mm-hmm. I never considered that there was a human on the other side of it and that there was more to the story. And I've apologized for the comments that I made years ago profusely. Mm-hmm. I apologized in the paper. And I apologize more so because those comments that are now attached to me, comments that were made within a 5-minute period that were not ever intended in the way that they were then used in a news story. Mm-hmm. I would never, ever in a million years make fun of a child, ever. I would never use a derogatory remark. It was a trigger from something someone else said, and mm-hmm. It was a stupid mistake, but that's all it was. It was a teacher that dedicated her life to, and I still do. I still dedicate everything I do to making the world better for the kids that are in it. And I know I'm not defined by what happened years ago, but every now and then, kind of like sideswipes me. And I have to remember, that is not me. That never was me. But it took me a long time to kind of get where I am today. And I always embrace this story because it's not a story everyone has, but it's such a story of making a mistake, and it's not and doing better, and just making sure that everything you do after that is better than the day before. And it's not this redemption story. I didn't redeem anything. I made a mistake. And I'm still here, and I'm not really going anywhere. And everything I do is to make the state of education better, because it is in a world of hurt, in my eyes, in certain areas. We have major equity issues. And, I work with LGBTQ educators and certain little passions that I have to make safe spaces in school for students and teachers. And that's what I'm going to continue to promote and to work on. And that's a lot of the work I've done on Twitter.
So, wow. Okay.
Yeah. Probably like a bigger story than you imagined, but.
Well, yeah, I know from, I've had a couple of experiences that are not the same, but similar in that I've been able to see, the media front, the media facing side of the story, and then knowing the real story. And even something as simple as I remember doing, an interview with just a local paper when I was in high school. Yeah. And the number of things they got wrong was astounding. The level, it was, it was for a play I was in high school. And they interviewed us for this thing because we were going to provincials, and just the number of details they got wrong was just astounding. Right. And I mean, that kind of stuck in my head and every now and then I'm thinking, how much do they get right? And I mean, also, I understand in your situation, it wasn't necessarily what they got wrong, but it's just the details they chose to share.
Well, and that's what it was. It was this, you have It's almost as if someone, and this was what was so insanely hard for me to I couldn't control it. There was nothing. I
Hmm.
mean, we weren't allowed to talk to the papers, and I remember at the time wanting to call and saying, "Wait a minute, that's not how we meant those terms. Like, you're painting us in this picture. That is not us." And we weren't allowed to do that. But even with the latest article that came out when I was at the Department of Education, I had to laugh at one point because there was almost this insinuation that she went under a different name. Like I changed, like it reminded me of the scene from Breaking Bad when Walt, like the jig is up and Walt has to call Saul and he gets a new name and he hides out in the woods. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, I was separated from my husband. It's just my maiden name. Like I didn't pick something out of a hat. Like there was no, and everybody knew. Like when I went to the Department of Education, it wasn't like they didn't know that was my maiden name. You know what I mean? Like I thought, wait a minute, I followed the rules, yet in the paper, you would have thought that I had a secret name and no one had any idea who I was. Um, and it was just things like that. Whereas, like, that makes a great newspaper article,
Hmm.
but that absolutely is inaccurate. And that is absolutely not true. I deserved to work at the Department of Education. I did a really good job at the Department of Education. I shouldn't have lost my job. But that's sometimes your collateral damage for bigger issues in politics. So
Hmm. Hmm. But you have come through this, obviously,
yeah,
still with your passion intact.
yeah,
And you're talking, right now you view your role as changing the state of education. Can we dive into that? Kind
yeah,
of leave all the other stuff behind for a while.
yeah, yeah. No, and I think that and that's fine for me. So
Yeah.
it's really it's powerful to work on your own and
Mhm.
to so right now I'm working on a podcast and I'm working on a blog, and so much of what I can say I don't have to think, oh, but I don't know if my admin's going to like this or my union, or I don't know if the state's going to let me say this.
Mhm.
There are things in education that bother me tremendously.
Such as?
The lack of Black male educators is right now it's 7% nationally, and even locally here in New Jersey, it's about the same.
Mhm.
There's issues in our recruiting process. There are implicit biases and racist tendencies in the hiring practices. Um, and all of these things that exist in education, I think should be talked about. I think they should be talked about at Board of Ed meetings. I think they should be talked about with stakeholders and at your Tuesday, afternoon staff meetings. Things of how can we make our staff look as diverse as the student body? We know the data says that that's important. We know that the data says that all children benefit from a teacher of color. Yet it's when I worked for 10 years, that was never part of our initiative. That was never anything that I had talked about with administrators, with staff. Um, and that's the type of conversations that should be happening in schools. Um, I have a daughter who is openly gay,
Mhm.
and she struggled in middle school with bullying and being called horrible names. And to the point where a lot of kids that weren't open were certainly not ever going to come out of the closet on that one because it wasn't an environment that felt safe. And I've been in high schools where they have safe space stickers on every door,
Mhm.
that they have GSAs in every school, they have staff that are trained in talking to students, that students know that they can go into a certain staff member's room to just talk or to feel safe. That should happen in every school. The equity issues that we have in education and the lack of access to resources, basic resources, they're not the same in every school district. And that's not right either.
Mhm.
And those are the types of things that I'm passionate about. Um, there are things happening in schools that should not happen. And it is not the teachers or the admin in those schools. They have a lack of resources. And we just had a state aid thing happen in New Jersey where a lot of districts lost a lot of state aid and a lot of districts gained it. And when you look at certain districts and how they either spent that money, um, a lot of it was on higher level administration type positions, and not a lot went to classrooms in a certain district.
Mhm.
And I thought, no, that's not right. And do people know that? And do parents know that they're allowed to go to the Board of Ed meetings and listen in on budget talks and make comments? And I don't know. So a lot of the work I want to do is around researching what our state needs are,
Mhm.
having conversations with educators around the world, which is something that I'm working on now,
Mhm.
and also just advocating for parents. I work with parents now that are trying to get 504s for their kids, or don't understand how the IEP process works. And I'm happy to work with them. I'm happy to sit next to them in a meeting and help them know what their rights are, what their child's rights are, because a lot of them don't. And I didn't either when I went through it. I didn't know the whole process. But once you've taught for a while,
Mhm.
and I've sat on our INRS committees, and I know what an IEP meeting should look like, um, these are things that I kind of just want to give back and just give a little insight, and talk to teachers about how to speak up at your union meetings and how to get involved and just things like that.
Well, that's a lot of hills to die on. Wow.
I know. So I'll make a small list, and then,
Yeah.
slowly, save the world, I guess, starts at the end of it all. But
Yeah. So I mean, there's as you say, there's a lot of issues in education. I mean, I'm up in Canada, but a lot of what
yeah,
you're saying resonates.
yeah.
I mean, our problems have a little bit of a different color to them, but at the same time, you've got all these different things that you're passionate about. I mean, how do you boil that down into like a functioning job?
Yeah, well, I don't, I'm finding my way there. A lot of what I'm doing with the podcast. So I'm creating a podcast right now that is more geared towards teachers that are ready to go. And it's not like, hey, if you're ready to go, listen to this, I'll save your. It's not that. It's
So, like, ready to go in what way?
they're ready to leave the profession. So
Okay.
my last year, we had teachers that were teaching for 25 years that couldn't wait to get out, and I
Hmm.
knew teachers that were teaching for 2 years that were looking for jobs.
Right.
And I thought, what is going on? And the bottom line is it had nothing to do with the kids. They were
Hmm.
stressed, and there is sometimes an easier way to do the job if you allow yourself this moment to breathe and say, I can only do my best. My room doesn't have to look like it's out of a Pottery Barn catalog. I don't have, you know what I mean? I
Oh
don't
yeah, thank
have to
goodness.
spend $1 million to create an environment for my kids that's conducive to learning. And I think, and I've tried to work with teachers before to say, listen, change your mindset a bit. And the accolades are great, and having admin really celebrate you, and the high reports in your observations are always the high scores of your observations are always nice to have, but you cannot burn out worrying about those things. If you truly look at the data that's in your classroom, look at your kids and meet them where they are, see what you can do every day to make it the learning environment a little bit better for each kid. Take the pressure off. Don't assign homework. Look at your tests, and if the kids all failed them, throw it out and make another one. There are things that you're allowed to do in your classroom that I don't think a lot of teachers realize that you are allowed to do it. I
Hmm.
think we're in this like systematic sort of, no, I have to do it this way, and I have to give out homework, and I because that's what we've always done. I have to set up the desks this way. You know what I mean? And I thought,
Yeah.
if there's a way to talk to teachers and say, you don't have to do anything. If there's a reason that you've made the decisions you've made and it's backed by either research or practice or advice that you've received,
Hmm.
that's where you can kind of stand up and say, listen, this is why I'm doing it this way. And I've worked for administrators that my teaching style is what one referred to as extremely loose. And, I had kids on the ground and kids in the hallway, and I had papers all over it looked like John Nash's office. I mean, it was a mess, but we loved each other, and my kids thrived and they were successful. And I didn't really follow any sort of rules. I just kind of felt where we were, and we
Hmm.
just did it that way.
Yeah.
And I didn't feel a lot of stress in my job because I didn't allow it to seep in and dictate how I did my everyday tasks. And if that's the message that I can send to teachers through a podcast or through a blog post, to help one teacher just breathe and say, okay, I had a really crappy day today, but I'm going to get back in there tomorrow and just do it again. I'm not going to bring what was yesterday into my today. I'm just going to start over and do the best I can. And that would just be my all-time goal. You know, where I work after this or where I'll eventually go, I have no idea. But for now, if I can just give back to these teachers, to give back to their kids, I mean, that just makes me happy.
So to clarify one thing, you talked about gearing your podcast towards teachers who are ready to go. Now, do you mean is your message to give them a path out of the profession, or are you like, no, wait, hang on a second?
Hang on a second. It's the hang on a second.
Okay. I got it.
Because, and I think that you're talking, the woman that is running this podcast, the woman that is hosting this podcast is a woman that left and every day misses it. And I was ready to go. There was a lot, like I was ready to move on. And it is one of those jobs that when you leave, it's very hard. Not that you couldn't make more money somewhere else, not that you couldn't be less stressed somewhere else. It will not fill, another job will not fill you the way teaching kids does. And I can tell you that because that's where I sit today. And I have a unique perspective of a woman who's been through the ringer, and I have been on the highest high in teaching and the absolute lowest low. And every day I loved my kids and they loved me. And that's what kept me in it for as long as I did it. And I had to learn through the years the things that I was really going to do. Like in my first couple of years, my classroom was totally adorable. And the bulletin boards were cute and, you know, everything was cute. And by my last year, I think we put a bulletin board up together. I mean, my kids did it. I didn't do it. You know, there was just things you learned that you took the pressure off areas that you didn't need to stress about. And I think that's what it is. It's talking to the teacher that is driving home from work and they feel like they cannot go back there tomorrow. You know, and just having stories of teachers that have overcome challenges, that have made mistakes and they kind of learn from them, and having teachers that have been doing it for 30 years and could do it for another 30.
Yeah. I mean, I've been there. I know what that's like.
Yeah.
I remember having mornings literally walking in the building and just repeating to myself over and over again, I love my job. I love my job. I love my job. Just to get myself
so many of us
through
have been
the doors.
There.
Yeah. But you know, I found my joy again, and here we are. But Maire, man, you have an incredible story, and I feel like we've only just kind of scratched the surface of a lot of stuff.
Yeah. And it's funny because, you know, these amazing people that all went through this process with me were all amazing teachers. And to be honest with you, that stupid chat and those jokes that were, I mean, at the time, I didn't even think about it. I just thought, well, these are my friends, so they know I'm not serious.
It's no worse than anything that we say in the staff room.
And I've said exactly, and that's the thing. I mean, we all talked, and I thought, oh my God, we've all said worse, and we've all made bigger mistakes. But it was a good story at a time that I think the world needed a good story, you know. And I think 5 years ago, teachers were we were getting killed left and right, you know. So if you could make us look like horrible people, that's what the public wanted to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you pulled through. I'm glad you made it.
Thank you.
So before we run off, though, how can people get in touch with you?
So most of my work is on Twitter. So I'm at Maire Cervenak on Twitter, and I don't know if I need to spell that.
You might want to, yeah.
Yeah. So Maire is my nickname, and it's because my real name, Mary Ellen, although my mother will hate me saying I hate it, but I hate it. Maire has always been me, you know, since the day I was born. My mom called me Maire. My father, like, everybody does. So it's spelled Maire, very Irish of me.
Mm-hmm.
And then my last name is Cervenak, Cervenak. So I'm at Maire Cervenak on Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the work that I do is on Twitter. A lot of my PLN that I do work with,
Mm-hmm.
we have ed chats and all of those things. And there's a
And,
lot of things coming out.
Yeah. And your podcast is assumed launching shortly, so they'll probably be able to find their way through to that.
It is. And I'm going to post my blog up first. The blog is called Teacher Interrupted.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm pretty sure that the podcast is going to be the same name. At first it wasn't, but I kind of like the name Teacher Interrupted. So it will all be up on my Twitter page.
Beautiful. All right. Well, man, thank you so much for just really being such an honest voice. I really appreciate it. Thanks for being on the show.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure.
All right. Well, you take care, and we'll see you out there on the Twitterverse, and all the best on your podcast too.
Thank you so much, my friend.
This week's episode of Ed is brought to you by the Alberta Podcast Network, powered by ATB. You can find all the homegrown Alberta-made podcasts over at albertapodcastnetwork.com. And while you're there, why not check out Girl Tries Life? It's a podcast that has tangible advice for living your best life. Every 2 weeks, there's micro-coaching episodes to help you tackle the challenging areas of your life. And every other week is an interview with a woman who is living an incredible life and continues to strive for more. You can find that at girltrieslife.com and all the other Alberta Podcast Network shows at albertapodcastnetwork.com. And if you want to listen to more of this show, you can head over to the website, theedpodcast.podbean.com, or find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcatcher of your choice. Just search up Ed Conversations. Ed can also be heard on Voice Ed Radio, which is 24-hour internet broadcasting devoted to the best ideas in education. Just head over to voiced.ca. So, on behalf of myself and Maire, thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time. Bye.